Are you feeling overwhelmed by the constant stream of news and current events? Well, you're not alone. In this episode, I host Julie Rose, the acclaimed radio journalist and host of the Top of Mind podcast. For over 20 years, Julie has reported for the NPR, Morning Edition, and All Things Considered, but she found herself increasingly anxious and angry about the news. So in 2022, she reimagined her show as a weekly podcast, tackling tough topics in a way that's honest and probing yet leaves listeners feeling empathetic and empowered. Tune in as Julie shares her insights on navigating the challenges of modern media and rediscovering hope in a divided world. Well, you've made it this far, which means you're probably a super fan of the show. That's amazing, and I really appreciate your support. To keep up with all the latest updates, make sure you're following the show on social media. You can find all the links in the bio. And if you've been enjoying the content, I'd be so grateful if you could take a minute and leave a review. It really helps us reach more people who might love the show as much as you do. Also, don't forget to tell one friend about the show as well. Word of mouth is the best way to help us grow. And if you're feeling extra generous, check out the link tree in the bio where you can find a link to donate. Every little bit helps me keep creating the content you love. Thanks for being an awesome superfan. I couldn't do it without you.
Let go. Asteroid of fear.
Welcome to another episode of the Men in the House podcast. And on today's episode, we have Julie Rose, who is the host of the Top of Mind podcast. And she has a backstory and career in journalism and radio. And we are going to have a quite interesting discussion today. I think this will benefit listeners if you are both man, woman, or a leader, a parent, anyone. But we are going to talk about kind of uncomfortable conversations, avoidance, and why is it hard to have scary conversations? And also, how can we keep from getting so angry if we disagree with somebody's point of view? And kind of the first thing that comes to mind when I discuss this is the holidays and a discussion with family. So, how are you doing today, Julie?
Hey, I'm doing great, Richard. Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yes, thank you for matching with me on Podmatch, and I'm excited to have you as well. These are topics as a leader, as a parent, as a spouse
Mm.
that are very important to me, and I think the listeners will get a good a good amount of information on something they could possibly put to use and or even just recognize that, hey, I feel this, and explore it a little more. Maybe this is what it means, and kind of
Mm.
look at approaches that were similar to your own. But let's start off by giving the listeners a little bit of your backstory. How did you get from kind of where you started in your career, maybe leading into your career, how you chose that, and then
Okay.
also um, how we both ended up here in front of each other on a podcast and kind of how it's
Okay.
translated.
All right. Okay. Well, if I go all the way back into ancient history, I studied communications in college, and I had always really wanted to do journalism, but I ended up choosing public relations because I was afraid of the deadlines and the stress around print journalism, and I didn't know about radio journalism. They didn't have an audio program, a radio journalism program, and I definitely didn't want to do TV where people would be critiquing how I look all the time. And so I said, well, my choices are either newspaper journalism or public relations. And so I thought, well, I like to write. I think I could do PR well. So I did PR, and I was in that field for about 7 years. And I just wasn't loving it. And I had fallen in love with public radio at that point. So this was in the early 2000s. And so I thought, well, maybe I could do radio, like radio journalism. This was before podcasts, back even before we had the iPhone. But I thought, well, maybe I could do audio stuff just kind of as a hobby. So I bought some gear online and I kind of started messing around and ended up actually becoming an unpaid intern. I walked into a public radio station in my community. It was a little teeny tiny one. They had one reporter and they were broadcasting out of a closet. And I said, would you let me just learn? You don't have to pay me. I just want to hang around and learn. I have a day job. I have a mortgage. So, I'm not looking to like change careers or anything, but in the process of that, started learning a ton and it was so fun. So I spent about a year doing that. Just like I would go to my day job in public relations and fundraising for a nonprofit. And then I would go cover city council meetings and go to the state fair and just file, do stories. And then if it was good enough, they'd air it the next day. And if it wasn't, I learned something, right? So I was just kind of winging it, and it was really, really fun. And then after about a year, they had a job opening, and I wasn't really qualified to be a reporter, but I came on board doing different things, and then everything sort of just fell into place. And they ended up needing a reporter, and I was there at the right time. And so anyway, that was the beginning of my career, kind of a backdoor into public radio reporting. So I stayed there for about 5 more years, and then I moved to North Carolina, where I was a public radio reporter. So this is for local NPR
Hmm.
stations, public radio stations. And while I was there working, covering in Charlotte, all the different things that were happening there during the financial crash and during the 2008 presidential election, and all kinds of really interesting stories happening there, I started also being a regular contributor to Morning Edition and All Things Considered,
Hmm.
which are two of the big flagship drive time shows that NPR has. Um, but then after about 6 years, so this would be now 10 years ago, I was kind of at the peak of my game and really enjoying it. But my parents started needing help back in my hometown, and they were aging, and I wanted to be able to help them. So I left my job, came back to my hometown, Provo, Utah, and didn't really know what I was going to do with my career at that point because there wasn't a public radio station. There still isn't
Oh,
really in
wow.
Provo, Utah, but the local college, university, Brigham Young University, which is actually where I went to school, had just was starting up a radio station, which I discovered when I arrived here. On satellite radio, Sirius XM,
Hmm.
and they were looking for programs that they could air. And so I walked in again and said, "Hey, can I help? What can we do?" And so I started hosting a daily radio show, which we launched in 2015, called Top of Mind. And so it was every single day, Monday through Friday, for 2 hours, live on the radio, doing in-depth interviews about everything you can imagine: news, science, culture, education, like everything we were talking about on a daily basis. I did over the course of 7 years. Monday through Friday, I did more than 10,000 interviews,
Wow.
most of them live on the radio, all of them complicated and in depth. So it was a lot of prep, a lot of work. And towards the end of those 7 years, I was experiencing frequent bouts of just like, I guess burnout is the word. I just couldn't do it anymore. But it really got to be serious for me um, when in around 2020, I could no longer, like, I suddenly just didn't want to consume the news anymore. I realized things had gotten so you'll remember we
Hmm.
had gone through the 2016 presidential election, and then we were now in the 2020 presidential election, and then we're in the pandemic. And there was just so much ugliness. And it just felt like the news, the other piece I forgot to mention is that I'm a clinically anxious person. And so
Hmm.
I I've been medicated for all of my adult life, and I just couldn't handle it anymore. Like the news it was depressing, it was polarizing, it was stressing me out. And so I was avoiding it, which is a problem if you're a journalist. I would kind of come to work and sort of like grit my teeth and do what I needed to do. And then I would go home and like turn on my music and avoid the news and just like not and then anytime I was on break, I would go for these long stretches, as long as I could manage without actually consuming any news because I just couldn't stand it anymore. And I was embarrassed by this because I thought, what am I going to do? I guess I'm going to have to change careers or something because I can't be a journalist who doesn't want to consume the news. What I didn't know was that 40% of Americans actively avoid the news, either entirely or for stretches of time, or or actively avoid the news about certain topics. So we're really into this avoidance. And when I learned that, I realized that I didn't have to be ashamed. And then my question was, okay, well, I'm a journalist, maybe I can do something about this. Like, what is it that is driving us to not want to consume the news? I think there are a lot of things that the media, like that the way the media works, the way the media has changed, the way the industry has changed over the last decade, are fueling a lot of the problems I described. But also there's a lot about our own consumption habits that we're in control of. And so I was given the opportunity, as it happened, right around the same time that I was experiencing this, like, I can't do daily news anymore. This daily show's killing me. We got to figure out a different way. I was given the opportunity to turn the daily show, into a weekly podcast. And that's when we really started thinking as a team, okay, so what could we do that would provide people with an opportunity to engage with the news? Because for me, avoidance it didn't feel right. One of the things that I care about at my core is being a good neighbor and a good citizen. And in order to do those things, I felt like I needed to be informed. I felt like, and I feel like um, and I needed to be informed so that I could have important conversations, so that I could make choices that I felt like were responsible when I would go into the voting booth, so that I could get engaged in my community, making the kind of place that I wanted to be able to live. So for me, pure and complete avoidance was not the answer. And so we started, so we decided to create a podcast where each week it would be for people like me, where each week we would take one tough topic that people are afraid to touch oftentimes, or think they know everything they need to know about it. And we would look for perspectives that would surprise us. We would look for people with personal experience with the issue, so that it's not hot takes from pundits that are just going to yell at each other. Like, you can get that plenty of other places. I want to hear from people who have skin in the game, who've been personally affected by, criminal justice reform, or policing, or affirmative action, whatever the topic is, abortion. And I personally, I don't, the problems that cause people to not want to be engaged with the news, things like it feels divisive, it feels biased, it feels depressing, like there's no hope. Okay, well, we're going to make sure we're not doing any of those three things. So we're not going to take a side. We're going to look for a range of perspectives that will surprise people, so that it's harder to just assume that there are only two sides. There's the good guys and the bad guys. So that I want to see that there's nuance here on this issue, so that I don't feel like I'm being told how to think about it, and that you're cracking me open to, like, I never thought of it like that before. Or, that is a perspective I never considered. That's what I want listeners to experience, because that's the kind of news consumption that lights me up and makes me think, well, there's more I want to learn here, rather than drive me into my corner where I'm just like, stop telling me all the terrible things, or making me feel bad, or making me feel like I don't know, like I have a bad view on this or whatever. And then whenever possible, if there are solutions, if people are doing things that are innovative and interesting, we're going to highlight those as well. And so it's an hour long, well, it's a 53-minute podcast, because it still airs on the radio too.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so it's a 53-minute podcast, and every episode attempts to do what I just described to you. So that's how I
Oh,
landed where I am. And then that also, I'll tell you in a second how that sort of has dovetailed, pivoted into not only how to engage with the news productively, but how to engage with other people productively on these important topics.
perfect. I got some questions. Of course, that
Great.
all that information kind of flooded me with. So I definitely think with kind of what I hear you saying is kind of you're in a space now that you can you can pick a topic, you can investigate it, and try
Mm-hmm.
to put facts out there without necessarily an agenda. Because I feel
Mm-hmm.
like what most people, myself as a consumer of things, when I think about the news, the first thing I think of is the news, like anything else, is a business. It's designed to sell. Um, what is their
You're very
agenda?
savvy. You're a very savvy consumer if that's the first thing you think of, because I don't
Yes,
think most of us do. Most of us think the job of the news is to tell me the facts, pure and simple,
to inform.
and to inform me. But in fact, a core underlying piece of information is that they have to make money. They're a
Yeah,
business.
and that's
So go
that.
ahead.
Well, that was
Props to
kind
you
of
for figuring that out.
that was kind of like what I thought of, and I'm like, do you find, well, do people think that way, and do you think that causes the avoidance? But did you ever sit and actually, I'm actually all about sitting with pain and discomfort and figuring out what it really is. Did you get to the root cause of what was causing you to avoid the news? Was it that kind of agenda aspect? Was it the fact that maybe you felt that there weren't unbiased opinions or information out there? What was
Yeah.
that core feeling that you eventually arrived at that said, because I think there's a certain awareness you have to go, this bothers me. This is my profession, kind of, that I love and or did love and enjoy, and now I don't. Why
Yeah.
is that? And that's, it doesn't feel right, but that's also kind of not in my character. It'd be similar to me
Hmm.
coming from a healthcare background, in that I think a lot of us who take care of people, it's not what we do, it's who we are, and it's hard to separate it. Now, just because I haven't gone back into healthcare, um, has no impact of who I am as a person and kind of my personal mission, which is to help others. And podcasting happens to be a method, a modality that I can help more people than just the places I'm at. And it's by introducing them to different perspectives, kind of like you said, that, hey,
Love it.
maybe I never thought of that. And if somebody can kind of get that piece of information, whether it's somebody who's struggling with a decision in their career, kind of like you had done, and then simply understanding themselves that they have to ask the question. But did
Yeah.
you get to that root cause?
Oh, Richard, I love that you asked me this question. Thank you so much. It's so insightful because I did get to that. And when you just said a moment ago that you're all about sitting in the pain, sitting in the discomfort, it's that. It's actually tied to that that I realized personally what my the problem, what was driving my avoidance. And it's also what drives my avoidance of engaging with other people on these important topics was fear. So when it comes to like fear for me, that fear in terms of news avoidance, the reason why I realized that I was so often just not wanting to engage was because I was afraid that I was going to get sucked into, that there would be no end on the other end, that it's just that it was that there was no, afraid of learning that it's intractable and that there is no solution, afraid of, and frankly, just afraid of the terrible feelings, afraid of feeling helpless. If felt for me so often, news consumption was beginning to feel, no matter where I turned, terrible things were happening in the world. I had no control over them, but I also felt like they really mattered, and I just didn't feel any empowerment. And so it was a fear. If you want to get really like into my psyche, it's the fear of not having any control, which is what drives my anxiety. All of my anxiety, I mean, even my like recurring stress streams are about not being able to control the environment and the outcome of a situation. And that is what just like triggers all of my anxious responses and all the unhealthy coping that goes on in my life. So really when it comes to news consumption, it, it it was fear of not being able to control, to do anything about it. like and just and then just feeling disempowered. And then on top of that, there was this extra level of fear that kicked in because I'm part of the problem if I'm a journalist, right? Like if this is my business and if I feel like it's driving this in me, then I must be doing that to other people.
I find
And
it
I really
interesting.
don't want to be in that position.
I find it interesting that you can fear something, that lack of control, but you're in a profession that basically highlights, illuminates the lack of control. Like the world is a big place. I mean, it's kind of like me.
Yeah.
Like I kind of love everybody. I love people. I want to help people
Yeah.
in the same way that you take on these important topics of the world. There, you have the whole world to contend with as
Yeah.
a somebody who's going to report on news issues or important topics. And that's such a heavy burden for because you have no control over whether it's what's happening in the Middle East right now, the elections, like other than your vote. I
Hmm.
mean, there's so many topics out of your control. So I find it interesting that fear is a major driver of your
Yeah.
anxiety, but you have a you go into a profession that's so wide open of so many things you can't
Yeah.
control.
I mean, I did not realize this coming in.
Right.
Honestly, when I got into radio, all I wanted to do was just tell interesting stories. And I actually didn't even want to be a journalist. I just wanted to tell interesting radio stories, but it turns out that now in the podcasting world, this is, 20 years later, there's
Hmm.
actually you can just sort of just tell interesting stories. But back then, like the only way to get into this career was really to go to city council meetings and start covering local news and start and having to cover bad things that were going on and malfeasance and failures and sort of hurts that people were experiencing. And so I sort of ended up in that. And over time, I think it compounded to a place where I felt like at the root of it for me was that I don't feel like I'm doing any good for anybody. I'm just making the world a scarier, harder place. Even if I am being factual and reporting these things, like it doesn't feel if I'm experiencing a level of overwhelm and anxiety by consuming the very best journalism out there, then what I can't compete with that. And also, I'm not even I'm not a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, and so what am I adding? Like nothing. That was part of it. Was like this feels pointless to me. And also, one of the things that I started to realize because I did a really deep dive into okay, so what would I want to feel? Like what would my news consumption need to feel like for me to not feel these negative for it to feel productive, for it to feel and one of the things is that I knew that I wanted to feel calm, that I shouldn't feel like it was like intentionally inflaming my emotions. And that there would be an optimistic slant to it. So not a like, oh, everything's rosy, good news, but these are tough things that are going on in the world, but they don't have to be hopeless. Like there is hope. People are working on these things. When there is movement and progress, I would want to see that wrapped in with also the tough stuff. And the biggest thing that I realized is that I wanted to feel empowered. And so I had to ask myself, well, because again, it's all about control for me, right? I want to
Hmm.
feel like I have some power over something. Okay, you're right. I can't control what's going on in the Middle East, but feeling empowered for me, can look a lot of different ways. One of those ways is at the end of that in my consumption, I see that there's a next step for me personally. And often that's one of two things. Well, maybe one of three things. It's that I now have a clearer idea what I want to consume next about this issue. So it's empowering to me when I realize, oh, I had a blind spot about this. Or there's this really interesting history between, about Gaza that I was unfamiliar with. And I'm gonna, so the empowerment is I'm gonna go check out a book on Gaza, or I'm gonna do this deep dive I'm gonna listen to this other podcast about, like, so for me, I feel like I'm in control because I'm actually moving forward and there's a next step for me. So that feels empowering. If I have had, if the, whatever the story I've listened to or the podcast has broken me out of my preconceived notions, or sort of widened my view and pointed out a blind spot, or pointed out that it's more complicated than I thought it was going in. That for me is empowering, because I know now I want to go look into this a little bit more. The second kind is as I've started consuming my news more mindfully, it makes me want to go talk about that issue with other people, which is also something that I've been driven away from because of fear that it's going to go badly, or that I'm going to have to defend myself, or that I don't know enough to be able to respond if they, come back at me, if they disagree with me, or that I don't, that I'm afraid that I'm going to say the wrong thing, right? Like all these fears, I'm afraid that I'll do harm, or that I'll hurt the relationship in some way if it's one that matters to me. So as I consume news that feels like I'm getting a sense of the broader scope, and I'm starting to understand what all of what different sides, people who see things differently from me, think, that it empowers me, gives me confidence and curiosity to want to talk to people about those issues. So that's an empowering piece, rather than to just feel like I know everything there is to know and there's no point in having any conversations about this. Sometimes it's like, I bet my brother has a really interesting view on this, because he has had those experiences that are different, and that never occurred to me. Like, or I have a friend who, is actually Palestinian, and I never thought to sit down and talk about, I wonder if they've ever experienced Gaza, or whatever it is, right? The things out there. Like, there's just a lot that it turns on my curiosity, and that then again is empowering. And I'm trying to remember what the third thing is that I was going to say. It'll come back to me anyway. Oh yes, no. A lot of times I find myself feeling like I'm in a better place to make a decision when it comes time to vote, or to be able to assess, like with the Gaza, but if we're going to stick on the Middle East example, when I'm consuming news, if I'm starting to have questions in my mind that I want to answer, and often it'll be, I want to go look and see where my congressman voted on those bills. And I'm curious to know, and actually now I want to know a little bit more about this person that I voted for and how they're coming down on these issues. And that to me is empowering, because it means that I'm going to be able to make choices and vote in ways that better align with my values.
Wow.
Hey, this is Amber McCrae with Connection Over Perfection. Check out my podcast, as well as many others, at the Podcast Connection Network. We are all about mental health and holistic wellness. The link is in the episode description. Enjoy the show.
The idea of informing ourselves, and I think for me, I have always felt as a news consumer, I long felt, even being inside of it, I often felt like I wasn't sure where to go to consume, or how to consume in a way that would really actually lead to this sense of empowerment, that could lead to, because part of what I learned, because the whole goal for me, like I said, it's work. And the goal is so that I can feel like I can be the kind of citizen that I want to be. And so you kind of have to start from that. I think a lot of us, though, want to be connected. I mean, we crave connection as humans, and we have a lot at stake in our neighborhoods and our communities and in our nation. But we also have these urges, these biases, you might call them, for seeing people who disagree with us as the other, and we have this fear response that's sort of innate in us that that can kind of flare up easily, and especially if we don't keep it in check, it can flare up unnecessarily when we encounter a perspective that we disagree with, and we have these sort of like our attention span, and we're like drawn to conflict, and we're drawn to simple narratives, and we're drawn to ideas that reinforce our own worldview. So
Mhm.
those are also natural. Like I'm constantly fighting these, on the one hand, I want to be informed and open-minded and curious and able to advocate for the things that matter in my community. And I also have these tendencies toward being attracted to conflict, in good and evil, and being afraid of people who are different from me, and all of those other things that I just described. And so I have to, one of the things I've realized, it's part of why I think it's so hard for us to engage on these topics in person, but also even just in our news consumption, we more and more have allowed ourselves, because we have so many choices, we have more and more allowed ourselves to live even without realizing it. I think we've been lulled into our little bubbles where we can spend a lot of our time sort of being exposed really only to ideas that we agree with, and also sort of seeing it normalized everywhere, that when you encounter a perspective you disagree with, that the appropriate response is to shame or defend or lash out or shut it down, dismiss it, and walk away. And so we are fundamentally, those of us who are keen to be engaged and engaged citizens and effective advocates and kind neighbors, we're out of practice. Like we don't have the muscles. We have to build up the muscles, the ability to sit in the discomfort
Mhm.
of perspectives that challenge us,
I think it's
rather
like
than
a
say, this feels uncomfortable, I'm going to bail out, or I'm going to fight back because I don't like the way this makes me feel.
well, that's probably the first question, I think, like you said, instead of people reacting initially, like we could break it down as simple as, let's say I want Trump for president and you don't, as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
going that it for many people it creates a like a visceral reaction. And they're like,
Yeah.
um, for me, and I think it's just more recently through sitting with discomfort, anytime I feel that initial feeling of disagreement, wrong, whatever it is from another person, I automatically try to go, well, why do I feel that way? What about this makes me feel that way? And
Wow. Brilliant.
I had listened to a podcast, and this guy said, anytime I felt, I think it's Mindset Mentor with Rob Dial, who's like, if I feel myself being judgmental of somebody, the first thing I do is try to find three things about them that I could compliment.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I found it even works like with a spouse. My wife and I weren't agreeing about something, and I just, and I had this initial feeling, and then I said, okay, let me pick out three things I could compliment her on. And
Did you say them out loud, or did you just like in your mind, this is a
in my
mental
mind,
practice?
because this was
Uh-huh.
over like a phone call or something, and we had hung up,
Yeah.
and I'm in
Yeah.
the car, and I'd been listening to this podcast, and I said, well,
Uh-huh.
I noticed myself doing it. I'm going to put it into practice. And it shifted a little bit, and you have to go, and then I was able to text her back and say, hey, like, I'm sorry I reacted that way. That was, but I don't,
It's
like you,
brilliant. It's brilliant. And here's the thing that because one of the questions that you had up front is sort of, why is it so hard for us to broach these important topics, or to even have any kind of a productive conversation with somebody? Let's say you're for Trump and not for Trump, right? Two
Mhm.
people. Why is it so hard for us to have to even sort of just have a conversation about anything, but to actually talk about that, to talk about politics? Well, uh, I mean, one of the key things is that that we have that we probably have lost sight of the humanity of the other person. So the idea of things that you can compliment about them, the thing that I often think about is I try to find something in that moment before I go any further. When I feel that energy come up, I have to recognize that my body in this moment is responding as though this other person is a literal threat to me, that
Right.
they're a tiger coming to get me, that I'm having this threat response that I'm conditioned to have, partly by the media and by social media and by the way the political, rhetoric is, and by my own sort of, comfort zone. I've sort of, like I've trained myself and my body has been conditioned to react in this way as though this person is literally the enemy. And so a great way to hack that is to try to see them as a human, like immediately. And thinking of 3 things you could compliment is a really awesome way to do it. The thing that I look for is something that reminds me that they're a person just like me. So I try to think, so it could be something, oh, look, they have a little bit of mustard on their tie. They're a human being, they had lunch and I like mustard too, right? I'm not looking for common stuff for like common ground per se, but just a reminder that this is a living human being and not some enemy avatar over here that I'm putting all of my, assumptions onto, or, reminding myself this person has children. This person loves her children, and I know her children, and I know she works really hard to be a good mom, I see what a beautiful, how hard he works to keep his yard looking beautiful in the springtime. Like, this is a human who has concerns and interests beyond just this one thing that we deeply disagree about, right? So I think that that's a beautiful, because that is like the hardest thing to do. And the reason why these conversations so quickly go downhill is because, or we avoid them entirely, is because we struggle to see the other person as human, and then secondarily as worthy of our time, as worthy of our effort to try to understand them.
I like that.
And that's the only way we can have, when you think about going into these conversations, that's the other thing, is that we have been conditioned to think that the point of talking about, again, let's say it's who we're going to vote for president, that the only reason that you and I would have that conversation is so that I could try to convince you and you're going to try to convince me. That it's that the only goal is somebody needs to win, and it better be me. Well, of course, that's going to feel huge and antagonistic, and and I think, I mean, do you think that there would be any other reason to have that conversation besides trying to convince me I'm wrong? Is there any other value to engaging in a conversation like that?
I think to understand, I don't know. Well, so with my podcast, part of it is I believe that we look and fight over differences, but we're all fundamentally the same at some level.
Mm-hmm.
We all want to love and be loved. And I think if you explore that even deeper, it's an understanding. It would be no different than volunteering at a men's shelter or women's shelter. Um, you're trying to understand that, and that understanding of what they must be going through or why they feel the way they do is that's the creation of love for another
Yeah.
human being. Um,
So empathy. I mean, I think that is one of the great reasons to have that conversation, is to experience new empathy,
yeah,
which you're talking, or to be able, and to be able to, the second thing could be to be able to better understand a different perspective that if I truly am and completely mystified as to how you could want to vote for a specific
mhm,
candidate. Well, I mean, there must be good reasons, right? That's a real lack of curiosity on my part. And so part of the value is to have is clarity, is to get more clear on why it is that these differences exist, and why 50% of the country is interested in voting for one candidate versus the other, because it's so divided in this country.
yeah,
So it's empathy, it's greater clarity on my own views. What I often find, if I'm not coming into the conversation to convince, but to gain clarity, or empathy, I actually make a lot of discoveries. And at the end of it, I can become a better advocate for my own view. So I didn't change my mind, and neither did you. But I have just had a window into to a certain kind of thinking that I hadn't considered before that would make you want to support the presidential candidate that you want to support. And that now has me thinking maybe in a conversation where I really do want to try to convince, like, I think my mom is maybe movable on this issue, and I want to
Right.
now I have a better sense of how I might address that with her, or kind of what it is that are some of the sticking points in another conversation about this, or maybe I have a better idea of how I want to approach campaigning for my own candidate, if that becomes something that I want to do. Can I share a story about this? Would you be okay if
Yes,
I
yes,
shared a story? Okay, so
absolutely.
this is a thing. This is a um I had an experience recently with a really good friend of mine. We've known each other for 25 years, and he lives in another state, and we only communicate now like on text usually. And we're very different politically. He's more to the right than I am. Um, but he also feels a lot more strongly about his political leanings
Mhm.
than I do. And he's really struggled over the last number. I don't know. He really loves talking about politics because he feels like I'm a friend who doesn't see things in quite the same way that he does. And so he likes to kind of joust, and I'm willing sometimes to joust. But a couple of months ago, we did an episode of Top of Mind, and one of the conversations was about cultural appropriation and trying to understand sort of what does it mean? What is the value of pointing it out? When is it not cultural appropriation? Is there really any harm that's done with it? Sort of trying to figure out why those conversations so often turn into really cancellation and shaming and anger and kind of all and hurt and all kinds of things, right? To try to get a clearer sense, so that we could figure out how to navigate those things in a more productive and responsible way. Well, he sent me a text that was like, I heard your conversation on cultural appropriation. He listens to the podcast sometimes. He's like, and I think that's a bunch of, baloney. And he's like, cultural appropriation is just a bunch of wokeness. And, he was giving me all this stuff.
Mhm.
And I was like, I got this text from him, and I could tell he was poking me a little bit, right? But I really didn't want to have this like text argument with him about it. And I had, so in that moment, I had two reactions. I was like, all right, this is a choose your own path here. I can either just ghost him. I'm like, I mean, we talk once every couple of months on text. It's like not, I'll just ignore this and pretend I never saw it, and we'll be in touch again at some other point down the line. Which is almost what I did, which is the avoidance, right? And then I was like, okay, Julie, you're always talking about how important it is to try to engage with tough topics in a way that is productive and to not steer clear of opportunities for better understanding.
I like that.
So, how can you maybe engage in a way that could help you learn something? And the first thing I had to do, and these are actually the kind of the tips that I would share with anybody. The first thing I had to do, and this was just a text conversation, but it can be true in an in-person conversation too. I had to get clear on my intention. So in that moment, I was like, all right, my goal is to have a conversation that deepens a relationship with this friend. I don't want to ignore him, and I don't want to
Right.
force a wedge. Okay. I also disagree with him pretty strongly, but I don't think I'm going to change his mind, and he's not going to change my mind. So I'm going to kind of take that off the table. Like, I don't want to have an argument that's going to try to prove that I'm right and he's wrong. I don't see that going very well. So what do I do to engage with him if my goal is just to better understand and also to show that I see you, I hear you, I appreciate that we're having this conversation, and I disagree, and that's okay. But I want to understand your perspective better. So, in that moment, then the next question was, well, how do I do this? Right. My message back to him is, well, you're right. We do disagree on this. I'd love to hear a little more about what it was that you heard that you feel like that upset you. Or, sort of like, what are you reacting to? And his next response back to me made it clear to me that he wasn't really reacting to the interview that I had done. It was sort of it became clear to me that this was a hot button issue for him. Like he just really hated when anybody brought up the notion that cultural appropriation is a thing and that it's harmful. And he felt like, and then I was like, okay, well, this isn't about me and it's not about the episode. This is about a bigger issue. And now that for me, then I was like, well, now I'm really kind of curious. Like, why do you feel so strongly about this? So my questions were all, I would sort of, he wanted to hear a little, he was sort of asking, he's like, well, don't you think this? Don't you think that? And I'm like, well, no, I don't think this, but I'm curious to know, so do you think in this kind of scenario, would that work for you? Or how about this kind of a scenario? Is that something that you think would be crossing a line into inappropriateness? And sometimes he'd be like, that's a stupid example. You're just trying to get my goat. And I'm like, no, but I'm actually really trying to understand. What I'm hearing you say is, and here's where all these techniques come in that I've started to learn. It doesn't work as well on text, but one of them is that asking questions to try to understand how and why an individual came to the position that they came to hold their view. So it's way more productive to ask a question like, what is it that you've experienced can you share an experience with me that has led you to hold this position, that led you to feel this way about this issue? So that's one that works really well because then you're not actually arguing about you're not talking about the issue. You're talking about the person and trying to understand their path. Now, in this case, I kind of miffed it. I didn't actually jump to that question, and you'll see in a moment why I really should have. But the first thing I did was try to gently flesh out his position on it. I wanted to kind of know, like, do you think all cultural appropriation is like not real, or are there some things you think are cultural appropriation? And so I was kind of trying to like flesh out where he stood on the issue. It's like, well, what about this? And how do you feel about this? And I'm like, this is something that I sort of feel like is crossing a line to you. And we were sort of kind of going around on that. So what I was doing instead was more this technique called looping, which is another great strategy in these conversations where you try to restate to them what it is that they have said. So what I hear you say is that you feel like in a lot of cases, things that are being called cultural appropriation are not in fact cultural appropriation. It's just people trying to police these boundaries. It's people taking offense inappropriately, right? Like I'm sort of trying to, and then he's like, am I getting that right? And then he says, no, well, he's like, well, yeah, mostly, but it's especially over here with this and over here with that. I'm like, oh, okay. And then and then looping is where you restate it again with the new information and then ask, did I get that right? And hopefully you get to a place where they're like, yeah, you get it. And with him, he's kind of like, yeah. But what I really want to tell you is this and that. Like he was clearly, he was, feeling a lot of big things. And but what the looping does is it keeps them in the conversation with you and in a place where they're feeling seen and heard, which gives them a positive emotion, which also keeps them out of toxic conflict and in a place where they're potentially more open to wanting to hear your perspective. Okay, so it keeps the conversation. You need to have like 5 positive emotional experience for every sort of challenging negative one in order for a conversation to stay in productivity. So that's a way to very quickly get to that number because you're sort of like, everybody loves to feel like they've been listened to so carefully that they've had, that somebody has been like, here's what I'm hearing you say. It's so weird how that like turns on these like dopamine hits, in our mind. So and then here's what happens. So I'm busy trying to get a sense and kind of looping with him. And this is going on for like 5 minutes. It's not like we're doing this forever and ever and ever, but it was like frantic texting, for a few minutes. And then, and at a certain point, and I can't say for sure, but I feel like it's partly because I helped him to feel safe and I honored that he had this viewpoint and I wasn't trying to dismiss him as a racist or as a, MAGA or whatever, right? Like I was honoring his humanity and viewpoint, while also acknowledging that I disagreed. All of a sudden I get like a really long one. I can see he's typing, and I can see it. And I'm like, I wonder what's coming, and I get this long one that says, you can tell you can probably tell this is kind of a hot button for me. I'm like, haha, yeah, I figured that out. And he's like, it's a lot of it is because, and then he goes to tell me on this personal story about how recently his wife had posted a photo of their son when, years ago when their son was a baby, and it was like, I don't know, they were at a Mexican restaurant or something, and so the little baby had a sombrero and a little mustache on, and it was just this cute, like, they're not a Hispanic family.
Right.
He was dressed up. They thought it was just like a cute baby picture, and so his wife posts this on Facebook, and he's in her Facebook, group, and somebody at his work, my friend's work, sees this and got really upset and called it out. And, like, it was really humiliating for my friend to be shamed in this way and exposed in this way in a public setting that felt like he's like, this was it. It just felt really, it was really harmful for him. Like, he was really hurt and
Like
also
being attacked.
embarrassed. Yeah, and he just and in that moment, I was like, okay, setting aside whatever anybody wants to think about whether it's appropriate or not, whatever, I get it. I all of a sudden I was like, no wonder you feel so, you have so much empathy for people who are getting canceled, right? In quote unquote in these situations. And no wonder this is such an emotional thing for you because you felt shame and embarrassment and that you were unfairly treated. And honestly, if I had been in that situation, I would have felt really sad and angry and upset probably too, and embarrassed, and especially to have it sort of blow into your work environment and kind of make that really awkward. Like, I get it. Like, I get that. Suddenly I'm like, oh, he's not just being a crank. Like, it turns out he had this personal experience. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, okay, well, I still largely disagree with your position that all cultural appropriation is, mostly woke and not real, but also I can see how you might feel strongly about this issue. And I really appreciate you sharing that with me. And I said in the text, like, oh man, that must have really hurt.
Yeah.
Like, I get that. That sucks. Thanks for sharing that.
Well,
I totally understand.
people forget, like, kind of like you said, like, ultimately it ended up being, whether it's a personal situation, something that happened to them, but people's beliefs or why they're maybe geared towards something can be from years of grandparents, parents,
Totally.
just as simple as saying
We have
we're
so many blind
Republican.
spots.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we're
yeah,
Republican. We're this.
absolutely.
But then what I was thinking about when you were talking earlier was that
Hmm.
they don't the the world doesn't help us. Like, what are we having? They're having presidential debates or whatever
Absolutely.
you
It's
call it.
all confrontational.
Right.
Everything. We
As
live in
opposed
an
to saying
environment.
your keywords were always a conversation, a conversation. Now, could you imagine if we were having a conversation to decide who should be the next president? I mean, how different does that sound? Or, like,
Yeah.
how different does it sound to say, like, when you mentioned, well, because I want to know what they voted for, what they stand for,
Hmm.
what they're about if I'm going to vote for them. So, as opposed to having, like, debates in these forums, like, I don't follow it a lot. I
Yeah.
just never have, but it's one of these things of saying, hey, we could, you know, if you just change the wording, no different than how you speak to yourself. If you change the wording around it, I mean, I don't know if it would potentially
It
change
absolutely
how we
does. There's
would.
actually science to show that it does. I mean, you're making me think of this great book that I recently reread for a book group that I'm in called High Conflict: Why We Get Stuck and How to Get Out. It's written by Amanda Ripley. Amazing book. Came out in 2020, I think. And she talks in that book about how even the language that we use, think about, if we're framing, and especially when it comes to making group decisions, if we're using labels. This is another thing that I often try to do, is immediately recognize, like, what labels am I affixing to the other person? Am I calling them a Republican? Am I calling them a Trump voter? Am I calling them a liberal? Am I calling them what are those labels? And how can I pull some of those labels back and just see you as Richard,
Right.
and look for some of the identities that you have that we might have in common. We're both residents of the United States. We're both podcasters. We're both really interested in having conversations. And I'm sure there's a bunch of other things. I wear glasses a lot of the time too.
Hey, after you're done listening to this amazing podcast, be sure to give it a 5-star rating, then go check out the other podcasts in the Podcast Connection Network, including my own, Everything's Connected. Check us all out. The link will be in the episode's description.
Of a Rubik's Cube about as well as the one that's behind you that's currently not solved at
Terrible.
all. So anyway, there are ways. But part of what I was just thinking is that we use all this language, and she talks about how there are unfortunately our government and our political infrastructure is set up to promote toxic conflict, to promote high conflict where it feels like a lot is at stake and where there's a clear winner and a clear loser. I mean, even our electoral system is set up so that, most states it's a winner take all. So it's not proportional voting. And, it's different. In some other countries, you actually see less toxic conflict and less polarization among politicians when the votes are assigned proportional to how many, what percentage of the community, like in a parliamentary system, right? So and I'm not going to explain this very well, but there are a lot of systems that are set up where it's not winner take all. It's not like here in the United States where you have to get 51% and then you win the presidential race, right? Or you have to get the majority, the more than the other guy, or woman, but it's mostly been a guy. But in a lot of other countries, it's like, all right, which party got, whatever percentage of the vote your party got, that's the percentage of seats in the House of Representatives that you are going to get. So there are different ways to arrange our political system. I'm not saying that we need to go to a different way, but there is clear evidence that you can create structures, you can even design your own environment, your own work environment to promote conversation rather than debate. To promote, I mean, you can set it up so that somebody is going to come in and have to pitch and defend their idea, or you can set it up as a group brainstorm where everybody's going to put ideas on the table. I mean, there are so many ways. And then with our simple language, come into the battle room, or or come to the brainstorm room,
Even when
whatever.
you
Like
said
language really
defend,
does matter.
yeah, just you saying defend, I could feel
Yeah.
something like go, oh wow,
Yeah.
like
That we all have blind spots. It's funny how resistant we can be sometimes to recognizing that, like how scary it can be. I'm one of these people when I'm driving where I will like get myself whiplash checking over my shoulder because I'm paranoid that I'm going to miss something in my blind spot when I'm changing lanes, and I don't have a car that has like the cameras and stuff in it, but we work so hard in our vehicles to overcome our blind spots with mirrors. We check over our shoulder and we have these like backing up cameras and everything. But in our lives, we're walking around with massive blind spots because we all have lived different lives. And so I don't, I don't know what it's like to be a Latino woman married to a white man in the 1960s in a white community. And because of that, there's a whole vast way of seeing the world that is off limits to me unless I can try to understand through exposing myself to other viewpoints, right? It's so easy to kind of get sucked into believing that the way I see the world is the way everyone else must see the world, when in fact, every single one of us is seeing it through a slightly different lens, or maybe a dramatically different lens based on our biology, based on the way our brains work. In fact, we did a whole episode about this at one point because people's brains function differently. And you remember that like blue dress, gold dress, big argument on on social media, I don't know, 8 years ago. It was like, the dress is blue, the dress is gold. I'm like, dude, you guys, it all is going to depend on your lighting and your screen and sort of the way your eyes, what you think is blue or green, like what you've been trained to think is blue or green based on the other experience you've had in your world. Like our perceptions are two things can be true. It can be both gold and blue.
I always say
And
that.
it's yeah. So I think the idea that for me, one of the things I try to encourage people to recognize is that it doesn't have to be scary to realize that you have blind spots. For me, that is one of the most thrilling moments, is when I'm listening to a perspective and it suddenly occurs to me, like in my conversation with my friend. And he says, I had this experience and it was really hurtful. And all of a sudden I'm like, oh, Well, that's a window into what you're, into how this particular view has been shaped for you that now I totally get. And I'm going to go back and look through our entire message and read each of those responses from you a little bit differently, because this is a key piece of information that was a blind spot for me. And I've never experienced that. And so I don't have the same perspective. But for me, rather than feel afraid in those moments, to lean in with curiosity, that's where the magic happens, because that's then where you deepen the relationship. That's where you start to feel new empathy. If we don't lean in, if we shut it off, if we decide this is too uncomfortable or a little bit out of my comfort zone, or I don't like the fact that I don't agree, that's when we stay in our bubbles and fail to connect, and things just get to be worse than they already are.
So it's interesting. Like, I think looking like at 47, experienced everything that I have, I'm at this point where the old way and where I'm moving forward, whatever bad information, cycles, habits, whatever, I want to break it because I have a 10-year-old daughter, and so, what immediately strikes me is like, but I'm a person who wants to change. And so I'm willing to
Yeah.
admit when I'm wrong, try to see my own blind spots, sit in the pain, and, try to be as humble as possible, so I can learn because I want to be better. But what I find is, I want to know if you have a perspective on this, given some of your work and whatnot. Do you find that there's like, I don't want to sound ageist, but why are maybe older people less likely to, let's say, maybe want to explore like a conversation that's not adversarial, that their beliefs are
Mhm.
their beliefs and they're just going to stick to them and forget what these young kids are saying? And I'm sure to
Yeah.
somebody who's 70 or 80, 47 is young, you
Yeah.
know?
Well, yeah. Well, that's what I was just going to say. I got news for you. I'm going to be 50 this year. So we're in the same cohort. We're getting to be the old ones.
Right. I know.
I work with a lot of college students who are like 19, right? 20, and they think that I am some like old wizened lady, right? So and so here's one of the things that I often try to do when I think about issues like this is one thing that I would call out is, so we're lumping
Hmm.
people into older, right? That what if we remove that label and we think about, um, well, for example, my aunt is in her 70s. Is she? She's probably in her late 60s at this point. And she has become one of the people, she kind of just out of the blue started texting me and wanting to talk more about a lot of these tough topics. She's like, I never really thought much about race. And I never really thought much about, I used to, like, Donald Trump has me thinking about things in a different way now. And I'm starting to think about, like all of a sudden she actually, so here's somebody who's like into her retirement years. And I am like, you know what? I have great respect for that. So I do think that, and I actually know quite a few people who you might consider older, who are in the
Hmm.
who are baby boomer age, who are open to having conversations. So my thought then is, what do you do if you're in a situation where you want to have that conversation with somebody who doesn't seem like they're open? So maybe your grandparent or your parent
Hmm.
seems to be more of the like, my views are my views. And look, my
Right.
grandpa was like that, right? Okay. Um, so I don't think that that all old people are are closed-minded. I do think that there are generational differences, and certainly folks who were raised in the boomer years, that boomers come from an entire culture where even to express discontent was considered uncivil, and there were coded racial language involved in that. Some of these people were alive during the years of segregation or experienced the desegregation of their high schools, and that comes with a lot of a lot of life experience that you and I didn't
Mm-hmm.
experience. And so, so there's certainly I think that there's generational differences in in how willing we are to kind of confront things. I think they didn't also have social media. What's interesting to me is to look at the younger, like the what do they call them? Gen Z folks. We're
Mm-hmm.
more like
X.
old millennials or very young Gen Xers, right? So when you look at millennials and then the Gen Z folks there, they're a lot more because they have social media and they have all these opportunities to kind of take a stand and also to be expected to take a stand and speak their voice, where I think our generation, just what was going on and what was available to us, and we didn't have social media to get on and spout our views, and so that just wasn't, we were too busy being angsty and listening to our Nirvana or whatever, but we were Pearl Jam, but we weren't, like on social media trying to be an activist. Like we were rebelling by,
I
listening to our
just
moody
I
grunge
just
music.
realized though, as you said this, something resonated with me, and I'm always about like doing the right thing, and when you said we didn't have social media to blast it,
Mhm.
maybe that's why I'm so much more interested in doing the right thing versus saying the right things.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, it was
Um,
definitely less performative. I mean, young people today are, not only do they have the opportunity, but they're expected to sort of have a public persona and to perform in a certain way by taking a certain stand, and you have to post the right kinds of emojis when a certain thing happens in Ukraine or in the Palestinian, territories or
right.
whatever, right? Like it's a very, that kind of pressure that we just didn't have. So we had different choices in terms of how we engage with difficult topics. And so I think instead of, so for me, what I'm often looking for is how, trying to acknowledge that maybe engagement, the expectations were different when they came up, and they might be open, this an older person in your life, to having some of these conversations. They might not, but when you said they are stuck in their ways and they're not going to change their mind, well, keep in mind that your first goal is probably needs to not be trying to change their mind, but to better understand. Even with my very set in his ways dear grandfather who died a couple of years ago in his 90s, when I would start to talk to him, even though a lot of his views were absolutely offensive to me, and he was a real curmudgeon in a lot of ways, uh, the times when I was able, he was lucid enough to actually, where I could ask the questions like, so grandpa, what was it? Were you involved in politics when you were young? Like, what was that like for you? Oh, I was a big, Nixon supporter. I was a big whatever. And I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Well, why? He's like, well, I thought that all those Vietnam protesters were just a bunch of, right. Like, and so then I'm getting a sense. I'm like, oh, well, is that because, like, no, you didn't fight in Vietnam. You were in Korea. Oh, okay. And so you felt like the Vietnam protest, that there were, like, what was it that was kind of driving? And I was able to learn by kind of trying to go back into his life to try to understand what had shaped his views. And for me, that was really enlightening. It brought us closer together. It helped me see him with more empathy, certainly, rather than just writing him off as an old racist, and it helped me to realize that I had some blind spots. Like, I remember once after a conversation with him realizing that I really didn't know much about the difference between the Korean War vets and the Vietnam War vets, and that I probably needed to go back and figure out some of that, because that was a blind spot for me in my history that had shaped a generation of people that were that are my grandparents, and I needed to figure that out. So anyway, I think there's still opportunity, but I think always it's going to have to start with seeking to understand.
Yeah, there's so my wife, she takes care of older people um as a job, and then she has a client who was born in 1927, so he's very
Mm,
old, but I get enlisted to go and sometimes like if he needs something and I'm
sure.
Ubering on the weekends, I'll be like, oh, I'll take him his groceries or whatever, or do his help him with his Gmail. And it's
He
just
does Gmail? That's awesome.
yes, yes, he pays all his bills like that way. He's very, very with it. And
Yeah. See,
you
and look
know,
at that preconceived notion I had just right there, assuming
well,
that he like couldn't handle any of that
it's
stuff.
just crazy. Like we never really talk about politics too much, but it's interesting because I was in the Navy, he was in the Navy. I was
Yeah.
on I was on one boat and he was on the boat that replaced the boat that I was on, but like so many years
Hmm.
later. And we'll see like the Middle East thing will be on the news and I'll walk in and be like, "Oh, how's it going?" And he's like, "Well, this is what's going on and there's some protesters at the Golden Gate Bridge and but typically what we talk about is we can talk about even just in the town where I live. I can remember before going in the military as a young person, like the nearest grocery store was, let's say, 17 to 20 miles. And, now there's one in 10 minutes either direction of where I live. And, he was able to elaborate, like, I remember when this grocery store started and that you didn't even have like one of these grocery stores. One of the things they do is their people take your buggy out and unload your buggy for you. They still do at this company. Well, back in the day, he said they used to actually walk people's groceries home with them,
Hmm.
because it was still people were walking to the grocery store, and to see that amount of history is it's you know it's crazy to think when we're in our discussion to think about how much has shaped kind of his views,
Yeah.
um and whatnot. And while I haven't asked him specifically, I think, I don't know, but I just know whenever I go over there, um, it's always kind of like a probing of discussion of trying to, learn more about that and learn. Um, I can probably kind of guess the views he has without directly asking him
Hmm.
because I
Why
have
not
friends.
ask? Why? But do you think
Yeah,
it would
I
be
don't know.
inappropriate to ask?
I don't know. Maybe I need to. My wife says he actually enjoys me coming over and misses me. So I'm like, maybe next time
Oh,
I
yeah,
will,
yeah.
I'm
Here's
like,
what I would recommend. I would recommend and this would be my advice and for anyone looking to try to have maybe a deeper, more meaningful
mhm,
conversation, especially about some of these hot button issues, right? Where you feel like I think I could have something to learn by understanding his views better.
right,
um assess the moment, make sure that it's maybe, in this case, make sure that it's a good day for him and that, maybe that it seems you're not rushed and he's not rushed. And this doesn't have to be a super in-depth thing. And then the next thing that I think is really important, especially when it's like somebody who you haven't been in the habit of having these conversations with, so that might be a family member you know really well, but you guys have always avoided politics because you just haven't wanted to go there, but you've decided that that's not good enough anymore and that you really actually do want to be able to understand one another more deeply. I think it's always good to ask permission, which is as simple as, I would really like to better understand where you stand on politics, a little bit more about your political thinking. Would you be willing to share some of that? I'm not entirely sure where you stand, and we may actually disagree, and that's okay. I just would really love to learn more. Would you be willing to share a little bit? Just, make sure, because otherwise, if you launch into it, they might feel like they're getting ambushed or they don't know because we've been trained. We watch
right,
people get
to
ambushed on cable
defend,
news all day long. And so they might all of a sudden be like, oh no, where's the camera? I'm being ambushed, right? So you want to try, I think we have to ask permission these days to kind of just say like and express your intention, and then you have to be true to your intention when you go into that conversation and make sure that you're not ultimately trying to argue or convince them. So you have to be very careful about. And then I think I suspect that he'll be quite flattered, and and then you'll want to start with, kind of warm them up a little bit. And it doesn't have to be a long conversation either, but it could be just as, so how, you know are you a member of a political party? And who do you support for president? I'd love to know a little bit more about why. And then if you start saying stuff that is like really pushing your buttons, and you're like, I need to fact check you on that because that's not true. And don't you know about this? And like all that's going to come up, right? If you disagree with him, um, try to resist the urge to do those things or to counter with your own perspective until he's invited you to. But instead, follow up with another question. And when in doubt, you're good at asking questions because it's your job, or that you're at least a hobby of yours. But I would recommend starting with like aim your questions toward understanding what experiences he's had. can you share experience from your young adulthood when, who do you remember who you first voted for, and how has that shaped the way you think about politics now? And
George
what
Washington?
is Oh, so yeah, exactly. I mean, if it starts to feel like if you start to sense your emotions getting high, take a breath and just say, tell me more about that.
Well, one of the things I think that's um, kind of where it falls into this is I'm naturally curious and about the
Mm-hmm.
person. Like I'm always interested, like, let's say when I was working in um, healthcare and I would get somebody in my office who I needed to help them with something. And they're like, well, I'm from Sacramento, California. And I'm like, well, how does one get from Sacramento, California to a town of a couple thousand people?
Hmm.
I want to know that journey.
Yeah.
But like with him, I know I could definitely, um, it's about getting to know him, why, he could offer some enlightenment on these topics. But the reason is because I'm on such the opposite spectrum of, let's say, you, whose role it was and you avoided it. I've always thought the news is meant to sell. I can't trust it. So I avoid it altogether. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm kind of a person that, in reality, if you were to ask me something, I mean, I'll wake up, I'll read a few headlines on Yahoo, local news, CNN, just to compare to see, are they similar? Are they different? Is one this, one that?
Mm-hmm.
Um, but really, mostly I stay local, which I heard on one of your podcast episodes that,
Mm-hmm.
staying local is your community.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, I know it's not great to be an avoider, but what kind of advice would you have for somebody like me who just totally avoids it because I'm either jaded or just don't believe. Like
Yeah.
I don't believe that whether it's news host, anchors, whatever, whoever controls them, like any corporation, because I worked for a corporation, you have to
Mm-hmm.
be aligned or say you're aligned or, there's some verbal gymnastics that happen, but um, because of that, I I typically avoid. And what would you
So
say
how do
to
you stay
somebody like me?
informed on things? Like, how do you know? Because it sounds like issues, matter. So on an issue that matters to you, how do you learn about what's going on with that issue?
I think if it's something that's truly an issue, let's say I read a headline or something,
Hmm.
um, local kind of pertains more to me. I would
Okay.
keep up on local stuff. I would just
So like
invest,
what's happening with your city policies, what's happening with
maybe not even policies. I don't even know that I go that deep. I'm more like, um,
what's happening local
is the
clubs.
power out? Is the
Oh,
power
okay.
out? Are there trees
Okay.
down? Who did this?
Okay,
Who
like
did that?
emergency stuff, crime
But I
stuff.
kind of come back. I mean, I come from, I worked in a level one trauma center for 6 years. And so I
Okay, okay.
think those kinds of things naturally jump out to me.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
but
So here's what I would say. It all depends on what your goals are. For me, there are certain like big political and policy issues that I feel like I want to be able to understand on a deeper level.
right,
Those are the kinds of topics that we're tackling on top of mind, So understanding why the immigration system in the United States is broken, understanding why the border is such a challenging mess, no matter what direction you look at it, understanding why our political system works the way it does, understanding what the role of the media is in a democracy, understanding how race works in America. Some of these things are important to me, and in order to get informed on those things, I think one thing that you said about how that the media can't be. I don't think you said that it can't. Well, maybe you said that it can't be trusted. I think that the way I would frame that is that there is no such thing as complete objectivity. Every single story is going to have a point of view there is a perspective. And if you even just think about, I mean, some media outlets have a political ideology that they explicitly endorse, like Fox News or MSNBC, right?
Right.
Some media outlets um, say that they're, objective, in terms of like they try to be, bipartisan, that they're not taking a political perspective. But every single story, regardless of the political ideology, every single story has a perspective because it's told by a human being and who talks to other human beings to share the story. And if you even just think about if I were to roll up as a reporter at the scene of a crash, a fatal 2-car crash, okay, one of the individuals died. So depending on who I talk to, that story is going to be a different story. If I'm talking to the family member of the person who died, that's a story that's going to have a lot of emotion, and they're going to have a certain perspective about who did this and how it happened and why it happened. The people in the other car, if I'm quoting them, are going to have a different, they were on the opposite side of the street, they're going to have a different perspective. The policeman who's trying to figure out, or person who's trying to figure out who was at fault, like everybody's going to have a perspective. The bystander saw something different take place than what the person in the driver's seat saw, right? Everybody's got a perspective that is going to shape how that story gets told. And depending on who I talk to and how much of them I include in my story and how coherent they were at the time that we spoke and who was available and who answered my call and who didn't, like all of that is going to mean that this story is going to come out a certain way, even though I made my very best efforts and I didn't roll into that story intent on, making it biased toward one or the other side, or I came in just to try to tell the story. But the fact of the matter is that people are going to have different perspectives, and I'm going to have limitations based on how much time I had and trying to tell a good story. And then on top of that, I want you to read it. I want to get clicks, and I'd love for this to go viral so that I get a little pat on the back from the advertising department, right? Or from my editor if it's a local paper. And so I'm also trying to tell a good story. So I'm going to look for some of the emotional things. I'm going to look for some of the conflict. I'm going to try to create something that you're going to be like, "Ooh, I want to click on that and read more," right? So all of that is just to say that every single story has a perspective, and it is unrealistic to assume that it will be any other way. And so you're totally right in terms of your pragmatic approach, which is they all have a perspective. Now, I tend to think that does not disqualify them all from being,
Right.
worthy of my attention. And so then the next question is, so what I try to do is I go in eyes open, recognizing that every story I read is going to have a perspective, and also that it's going to be biased towards bad news, that it's going to lean into the sort of conflict and the good guy, bad guy type stuff. And that the headline is going to be the most sensational part of the whole thing. Because it has a job to do, and that is to get my attention. And that the first couple of paragraphs have a job to do, and that is to keep me reading. And so if all I'm reading is the headline, all I'm getting is the sensational stuff that's firing up my emotions. And I told you way back at the beginning of this conversation that that's one of the things I don't want from my media consumption, is to just feel like I'm getting yanked around, emotionally manipulated, and fired up about things. That's where I feel overwhelmed. And I want to be able to see nuance. I want to be surprised by perspectives. Well, I'm not going to get that if I only read the first 2 paragraphs of an article, because those first 2 paragraphs have a job to do, and that is to suck me in, make me want to keep reading, or make me want to click and share before I finish reading the article. And so it's going to be the more intense stuff. It's going to be the more boil it down into the simple bad guys and good guys, right? The stuff that's going to get me more of the nuance, more of the understanding that I want, maybe even more of the solutions and the optimism and the hopefulness and the empowerment that I talked about early on, that's going to come later in the article. So my number one piece of advice is go deep. If you only have let's say you're going to allot 10 minutes to scanning Apple News. Like you were saying, look, you look at the headlines on Yahoo News and Apple News and CNN or something, right? And you're kind of comparing headlines. Well, the bad news is, Richard, that you're only just getting the kind of like salacious teasers there of what's happening in the world. That's going to tell you that they're all reporting on the, the Trump trials, and they're all reporting on whatever presidential debate is going on, and they're all reporting on Israel and Gaza, and they're all reporting on,
TikTok being banned.
what. Yes, exactly. All right. So you got it, right? So you got your headlines. That's great. If that's all you've got, those but that's not news consumption. You're not actually getting informed. All you know is what's being discussed in the world. But you don't know enough to actually be able to engage in a thoughtful conversation or make an informed decision about how you feel on those issues. The way to get to that is I try to limit my headline scrolling. I do what you described, but I do that in 2 minutes. I look at a couple of different front pages. I scroll down to the local news section and kind of scan that. So I've got my sources. If you're going to use the Apple News thing or the Yahoo News thing, that's fine. Although personally, I think that those are algorithm driven. So they're only showing you what you want to see or what you expect to see. And so you're not actually, it's kind of creating a smaller and smaller world.
Yeah.
I do not consume my news on social media, even though the majority of people say that's where they get their news. I do not want to be subject to the algorithms that are intended to inflame me. And that's what social media is for. So I do my news consumption intentionally. I go to I go to whichever news site I've chosen today. Maybe I scan the headlines for a couple of minutes and I pick one article. Ideally, it's an article about something. Maybe right now I'm really into understanding better what's going on in Gaza. So for this week, all of my articles are about Gaza, or maybe I'm really interested in the border. So all of my articles are going to be about that, or about the Trump trial, whatever it is. All right. Or something going on locally. And I pick one article and I read the entire thing. When's the last time you read a whole article, top to bottom, Richard? Every single word. Most people say they can't remember. So don't worry if you haven't read one in a long time.
It's probably been a couple of days. There's some that I actually.
That's good. And what is it that brings you to want
to
to read the whole article?
Maybe it's something I feel strongly about, or I want to know why. I don't want to know just
so
what
curiosity keeps you reading.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's awesome. So turn that muscle on. That's what this practice does for me is I pick an article and then I read it and I notice when I want to bail out. I notice when my first thought is and I notice why I want to bail out. And sometimes it's this is boring. Okay. Well, this is an opportunity for me to practice focusing. And also, it's only a couple more paragraphs from here. Am I bored because I think I know everything there is to know? Probably. So how can I refocus my attention here? Because this is an opportunity for me to practice staying curious when my body is telling me or my mind is telling me I know everything there is to know, because we're functioning on these like shortcuts. That's how our brains work. It like saves energy, right? But when we succumb to that is when we end up in these situations where we're having a conversation and we're immediately putting all these labels on top of the other person. Oh, they're this kind of person. Oh, they're that kind of person. Oh, they're this, So when I'm reading, it becomes practice for trying to do that less in person, where I notice, oh, here I am wanting to bail out because I disagree, or I'm annoyed at this, or I feel like this is complicated. Or sometimes I'll be like, well, that doesn't make sense based on what this person said earlier. Or wait a second, I thought you told me that the Democrats were the bad guys here because they're the ones against this. And now you're telling me that the Democrats also have this view that sounds a little more nuanced than you led me to believe in the headline. So, and those are all moments where I would feel like I'm going to bail out. But I force myself to keep reading and keep recognizing what's going on in that process. And the whole point is to strengthen my muscle, strengthen my ability to stay uncomfortable as I'm consuming information. One of the things that when I really am feeling like I want to level up is I won't just pick any news article. I'll go to the opinion section and I'll pick the opinion piece that I most disagree with on the page that day. and I will read it top to bottom. And then I'll be asking, but why? And what would I ask this person if I had them here in the room with me? And I'm focusing on not trying to counter argue every single thing they're saying or trying to like dismiss or fact check. I'm just trying to understand why they hold this position. What would it take for me to have that viewpoint? And try to understand, and some self-reflection about why maybe I have a different viewpoint. So that's one of the exercises that I like to do when I read. And so that's it really. Like for news consumption, if you feel like you can't trust news is out there because it's all biased, well, you're right. Every outlet has a bias. It doesn't mean that none of it is factual.
Right.
It does mean that there's some work that you can do, and it doesn't have to be overwhelming. You can pick one topic a week, read one article instead of scrolling for 15 minutes in headlines. Just like, I more often than not, when I'm looking for something to watch after work on a Friday night and I'm tired and I'm sitting in front of Netflix and I spend 2 hours reading summaries of, movies without picking one. That's what you're effectively doing or that's what I'm doing when I'm scrolling
Oh, I do it too.
headlines,
Yeah.
and I'm not actually having a successful or productive experience.
No, you're not getting anything out of it. And, I
Yeah.
think one of the
Yeah.
things that's kind of helped me is I've kind of revamped my morning routine to, I used to wake up and kind of typical go for the phone, read headlines. And I think part of it, honestly, was I think it's kind of like this ingrained feature from when I worked all the time. I would wake up, you need to read text, emails, news, you need to see what's going on, everything that can impact you as soon as you hit the ground running. And so I've consciously tried to really just know more. Like, I don't look at my phone. I basically journal. I sit for 5 minutes for now. I would like to go longer, but where I just sit. No
It's hard to meditate
anything.
for 5 minutes.
Yes.
It's
I set a watch.
shockingly difficult.
Oh man, today I was like 3 minutes in and I'm like, my allergies, it's supposed to rain. I'm like not even thinking about anything I should be.
Yeah.
But I found that kind of, being a little more intentional, not um not waking up and automatically scrolling for headlines because I feel like I need to get a fill on something to walk out the door prepared or knowing what's going on in the world today. Um, it, it kind of does that with strengthening if you want to know about something because I'm not doing it automatically anymore. Now, I find that I don't necessarily go to headlines as quickly as I
Yeah.
did. I still do it kind
And you're
of, but
seeking out information.
yeah,
You're taking rather than being a passive consumer.
I'm trying to be
You're
more
sort of taking
intentional.
initiative. I
Yeah,
love
more
that. I love that
intentional
word.
with my info and but yeah, that's one of the great things
That's
that
awesome.
I think anyone can do to really just break kind of habit and routine. And part of that habit and routine is some of the stuff we've talked about of, hey, as soon as you notice that something about a conversation with a person is causing some sort of reaction in you, is just to kind of stop and go, why do I feel this way?
Yeah.
And you know, why? So I'll ask you one more question before we kind of start wrapping this up. And that is, why is it so hard or scary for us to have conversations about important topics? Why do some people choose avoidance as opposed to leaning into it?
Yeah. I mean, I think some of it has to do with personality. Some of it has to do with the way we were brought up, what we consider polite. I'll never forget years and years ago, I dated a guy who I'm like a question asker. The way I show interest is I ask questions.
Mhm.
That's how I show interest. So, I was always asking questions because I'm interested in you. And it didn't last very long because it came out early on. He's like, why do you keep asking questions? Don't you know that asking questions is rude? And I was like, it is? And he had been raised in a household where asking questions was rude. That was news to me. I'm like,
I
well, how do
can
you find out
now
about
I can
anything or
see
anybody?
that.
He's like, if I had things I wanted you to know, I would tell you those things. And I was like, oh, I don't even know how to live in a world like that. So it wasn't a compatible
Mm.
thing, but for me, that was like a complete, mind blowing experience to find out that, hey, some people don't engage because that's not the way they were raised. And I also think though a lot of it is that we're afraid that it's going to go bad. We've seen it go badly. We've or we're afraid that we're going to lose the argument. For me, a lot of my avoidance on some of these topics, like I can ask questions till the cows come home if I don't feel like there's a lot at stake for me personally. So, I've spent years asking people about difficult topics and probing their viewpoints on things, but at a remove because I'm just the reporter here to be the conduit to kind of
Right.
put it all on paper for you. When it comes down to trying to have a conversation with my family member who has a very different view on guns and the Second Amendment, that's a whole different ball of wax because I am afraid to create a rift to damage that relationship. I think I've noticed that in some of the cases, uh, conversations around race are very difficult for a lot of white people in particular in America. And I spent a long time not wanting to engage in those conversations or to even read very deeply on those conversations on those topics because I was fundamentally afraid to learn that I had caused harm or that somehow I was not the person I thought I was, right? Like I was afraid about what I might learn. I was afraid that I might discover a blind spot. So again, fear is a big motivator for me. But I think it does drive a lot of, fear exists for a reason. It's to keep us safe, right? And um I think that we can let that get in the way of our ability to engage. And then the other thing that I think why a lot of us are afraid is because the goal we've set in our mind is that the only value is to do it to win. If you're not in it to win it, then there really is no point.
Or to
So
be right.
that raises the stakes where we already talked about there can be many other valid reasons to engage in these kinds of conversations. And it's not just sometimes maybe like if you're going to go into a presidential debate, then you better be in it to win it. The stakes are very high. But most of the time, that does not need to be the goal. It can be more empathy. It can be more understanding. It can be to deepen a relationship. It can be to just get more clarity about your own views so that you can better advocate for the things that you care about. So I think the biggest thing is that we can reframe what it is we want from those experiences, which can lower the stakes and actually open the door to realizing there's a lot to gain by
Oh,
going
that's a
there.
great answer. That is, well, how do you keep it like let's say you discussed the Second Amendment. How do you if you have two disagreeing points, how do you keep it respectful? Because like I had this immediate thought of sometimes like if it's with somebody you're very close to and you love is, to me,
Yeah.
I can be very humble and back down easily in the fact that I can say, what's more important, my love and relationship with this person or
Hmm.
being right? Like me,
Yeah.
I don't necessarily have to be right, which is a lot of
So that's
goal of
part of it.
some discussion. But
Yeah. Yeah.
how have you normally kept, or are there any techniques to keep it kind of,
Yeah.
we can just disagree, but you
Yeah, so
know,
some of it is what I've already kind of talked through, but the idea of, being really clear with myself what the goal is and recognizing that I'm not here to change his mind or to be heard. So it's my brother. I'm not here to change his mind or be heard, but that I am here to better understand, that I just want to understand. And I need to be truthful about that because if what I really want to do is own him or
mhm.
tell or like prove to him that he's wrong, that's a different kind of conversation. And I need to not pretend that I'm just coming in to understand if really what I'm trying to do is something else. So
It's
I try to be really,
manipulation.
really, I need to be really, really, really honest with myself. And if I'm going in to argue, believe me, we've had those conversations too. They have not ended well. And usually it has to end in a sort of like agree to disagree. I still love you, but I don't want to talk to you for a few days kind of thing. Right. So there can definitely be those. Usually I don't want those conversations. I don't enjoy those conversations. I don't feel like we get anywhere with those. I mean, I blow it a lot of the time because my emotions get going or because my logical brain kicks in. But how do when I'm successful, it is when I can keep my curiosity in gear, when I can approach all of it with a sense of openness and curiosity. So I'm focused on asking questions to better understand his experience, what experiences have shaped his views on this, on the Second Amendment and why he feels the way he feels, and that I'm not trying necessarily, and that when I am trying to clarify, right, to get to kind of better understand exactly what he believes about the issue, that I'm doing so in a way that I really employ that looping that I described, where so that he doesn't feel like I'm interrogating him about
Right.
what about this? What about this? What about this? So that I'm able to keep it in a safer place where he's experiencing being heard and seen, because I'm kind of repeating back to him in a very generous way. I'm not saying what I'm hearing you say is you don't care if other people are killed by these guns, blah, 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 blah. What I'm saying is, so what I'm hearing you say is that you've had these experiences and that it's shaped this, right? I'm like framing it in the most eloquent and most generous way I possibly can, so that I'm making him sound really good in my summary. And then he can respond to that with, yeah, that's very well put. Thank you for saying that. Or no, it's a little bit more like this. And so that's another real key to keeping us out of toxic conflict. And then the other thing is to know when to end the conversation. So a lot of times this does not have to be, you're going to start circling the drain when it feels like you're repeating yourself or when you're starting to flog the same issue. Once he's had some positive experience and maybe he's open to the door to hearing my perspective, maybe he hasn't. And if I kind of like test the waters with like, well, this is the experience I've had. I've never really, that's different from yours. And I think maybe that's what's shaped my perspective. If he responds to that in a way that isn't generous or feels like he doesn't know how to play the game, right? Like I can't expect him to. He hasn't had the same kind of training. And that I just need to kind of remind him, like, oh, okay, well, we're not quite to that place yet. Like someday he may be interested enough to ask me what my viewpoint is, but on this one, he's not feeling safe enough yet. And that's okay. This is just the first conversation, maybe of many that we'll have on this topic. And I think I try to end it before it has the chance to kind of peter into something
Right.
less productive. And so, and that is as simple as, although sometimes it feels a little awkward, it's like, when do I bail out of this? But once we've had, I just very graciously and generously say, this has been really interesting. I really appreciate you sharing your perspective with me. Thank you. Thanks for this. I think I understand a little bit better. I hope we can have a conversation about this topic again. Love you.
Do you think that
Yeah.
kind of not that it's not good to win, but maybe as a society we've become so obsessed with winning and we teach it to kids and all this stuff and
Mm.
capitalism is winning, that
Hmm.
winning causes us to go into everything to win versus understand, to
Sure.
convert.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Because I try to think of, what, you know, having a, you know, I have a 10-year-old that's the youngest, but we have a 19 and a 21-year-old too. And it's like, what can we do that's solution oriented to actually potentially change, get a culture shift of um, understanding each other so we can make the world a better place. And like you said, having discussions or conversations about who we
Mhm.
want to lead our country versus everything is about imposing our will on other people,
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think it's kind of part of the mission of the podcast is to help people understand they're not alone, and that you know as we navigate the chaos of everyday life, that um we can change, we can make it better, a conversation at a time, a person at a time. And I think we really need to be thinking about how we're going to do this, because I'm looking at the second half, but I have children who have more halves left, and um yeah, I definitely want the world to become more cohesive rather than divided.
Me too. Me
And
too.
hopefully, our conversation is an entry point to
Yeah.
people who are listening, um just to say, hey, you know, to turn on that curiosity muscle you were talking about, and going at it from there
Yeah.
as opposed to being divided.
Yeah.
Is there anything you want to leave the audience with?
Well, one thing I do want to mention. So obviously, if you want practice, um, listening to viewpoints that might surprise you, that help you feel new empathy, and practice getting a sense for what it can feel like to engage with tough topics in sort of the safety of your earbuds.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to have you listen to Top of Mind with Julie Rose. We're on all the platforms. Just look for Top of Mind with Julie Rose. But the other thing that's really exciting is that we're actually launching a new podcast this
Wow.
summer called Uncomfy, which is going to be all about people sharing a specific story where they, kind of like some of the stories I've shared with you today, something even
Mm-hmm.
small, like where they decided to have the uncomfortable conversation, to engage with the perspective that challenged them, to stay a little outside their comfort zone for a moment and stick with the discomfort long enough to feel some new empathy. These opportunities arrive in so many moments in our life. And so we want to get better at sort of embracing them. So Uncomfy is going to be a new weekly podcast. It's going to be called Uncomfy, sticking with moments that challenge us. And we'll be talking about it on the Top of Mind feed, so people will be able to find it there. But
Oh,
I
I
would love to
like
have
that.
you, Richard, come on Uncomfy and tell me a story about a time when you did this, because I'm sure there have been many.
Yes, there are. And yes, definitely go out and listen to Top of Mind. I selected a few episodes, and I enjoyed them. But there was a lot of good topics that I was like, oh, I could see myself, you know. But because some of them I'm like, oh, am I a news avoider? Would I
Mhm.
avoid this topic? But I can't remember. There was one that seemed to be
Well,
something
it's
maybe
not,
environmental.
yeah, we want to give people the opportunity. We focus on engaging stories and storytelling to try to keep you with us, because I recognize that you're going to hear something that challenges you. And, um, but ultimately you're going to come away feeling empowered at the very least, which I think is the best we
and
can hope for
and
when we're
because you
consuming the
and
news.
because you do that for your job, your living, but also I think your passion,
Mm.
what's your bottom line with putting it out there? Like, what's your, like, your integrity? What's your yeah, what's like your bottom line integrity? Like, just has to be truthful, it just has to be this, it just has to be that. And
For an episode, for Top of Mind to release an episode, and I'll be honest, I mean, we do a lot of editing and scripting, and we spend a lot of time. It takes us 2 months to put an episode together, a 1 hour
oh wow.
episode. It's a long time, and a lot of that time is spent really looking for sources for stories that we can include that are going to surprise people, no matter, and for me, every episode needs to, no matter what perspective you have on the topic, I want you to hear something that will challenge you just a little bit. So, and if we don't have those things in place, we won't release the episode. It
That's
also
awesome.
needs to have there needs to be some sort of, it can't inflame emotions just for the sake of inflaming people. And there needs to be some sort of sense of empowerment that I need to know that we've provided enough opportunity for you as a listener. Before we release it, I need to know that there are enough pieces in place that something in there will stick with you as a, oh, I'm going to go learn more about this, or this is a conversation I'd like to have, or this really challenged me, but now I see things slightly differently, or now I'm going to vote. I'm going to think about this differently when I go to vote. As long as if we've shown you that it's more complicated than you thought, probably that there is nuance, that there is a way through it, um, then it's a top of mind episode. So we really stick to our guns about that. We work really, really hard. There's so many things we've left on the cutting room floor because we're like, we just can't figure out how to make that a top of mind episode yet. We're still working on it though. So we got some really good stuff coming up here in the next couple of weeks.
That's awesome. I love that. I love that. Um, you're so dedicated and kind of have that integrity, kind of that strict of, I'm only going to put it out if it meets certain standards and criteria. I think that's very important, and a lot of people could take a few lessons from. So
Well, I'm very lucky
continue
to
on through
have the
life.
resources. Yeah. I mean, it's a different kind of podcast too. Like Uncomfy is going to be a little bit more sort of conversational and little bits and bobs here and there. It'll be much shorter episodes, but we're really trying to do something difficult, and I'm expecting our listeners to do some work when they tune in to Top of Mind. And so the payoff really has to be there.
It was great talking to you. And
my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Let go. Asteroid of fear.